In this part two video of our risk appetite, you can see that I've labeled this with best practices because in this video, we need to define some security policies, risk best practices, and basically figure out how we plan to address the risks, right? Mitigate, avoid, transfer, accept. Now, for those that we accept, but we want to put in things in place to ensure that that risk doesn't become more of an issue again. So we want to prevent it altogether. And we need to have policies and security hygiene of, again, all these security controls. So well, I guess the question is, well, how do we begin to do all this? And I've got a bit of a diagram here that I want to sort of walk through as we're sort of working this through. Now, the first part is, well, how do organizations deal with risks? Well, the first part is they've got policies, right? And policies come in many different forms and shapes and lengths and complexity and details and stuff like that, right? And then we've got our security controls. So we have our policy, that goes away, we define what that looks like, and then we implement a security control to prevent a risk from happening, right? So policies, so some examples of policies, if we've got password policies, we may have a server hardening policy, we may have an information security policy, an incident response policy, we may have a breach response policy, we may have maybe clean desk policy, and the list goes on, right? There's a boatload of different policies that we can have: crisis management policy, BYOD policy, data handling policy, just a lot of policies that can be implemented and throughout the organization, right? And then we've got typical controls in place where we'll go away, where we can implement controls with various flavors. And then obviously the main thing here is controlling that main output of that event or basically that issue, right? So that's what a control, we want to control the risk that's involved. So what are some controls that exist? Well, one control that I can think of is the separation of duties, right? Where we've got one person not having all the power to do everything, right? And when we have various duties to be completed within certain job functions and certain job requirements, we don't want to be giving all those duties to one person. We want to separate or separation of those duties. So basically, no one has all that power to themselves and then doing something that could potentially be harmful, right? And that's all it's about. When we start talking about separation of duties, think more in terms of insider threats. And this is predominantly around insider threat prevention. We don't want staff taking advantage of certain accounts or certain controls within the business. And we want to have a separation of duty across our job functions. And a big example is this is predominantly used through accounts. Now, if I had access to our accounts department, and let's just say I'm running an event, I'm going to say event, and then I have to give the accounts team through accounts payable and accounts receivable team, if I've got to send my expense sheet to those accounts team and say, well, my expenses in total are going to be $3,000 to run that event. Well, what happens if I had access to that accounts team and then I could go away and process my own refunds and stuff like that? Well, I could be malicious as well, right? I could claim maybe first class tickets and plasma TVs and the OLED TVs and stuff like that. So it's basically a control that circumvents us maybe doing insider threats. We could be malicious, but then you're circumventing those types of malicious in nature attacks to a specific requirement or a job function in this specific example being accounting. Um, Moving on, what about backups? So we spoke about accounts. Well, backups is another important part. If we've got maybe backups where you've got an audit that comes in every month to validate our backup processes, we may have to do that audit monthly, right, to make sure the backups are working correctly, everything is working, appropriately as it should be, right? So, well, what happens if the admin is doing the audits, right? And we don't want that to happen where the admin can go in there and maybe fudge the responses to those backups and say, yes, everything is running great, when in hindsight, maybe things are not running correctly. So we'll have to separate out those duties and those functions of the backup procedure to make sure, again, from an auditing perspective, things are done correctly. So separation of duties is the main one. Then we've got job rotations. So in most jobs, you've got a rotation period where there may be several people through maybe accounts or payroll, um, things like that, where every 3 months we rotate the job function. So if we know that in 3 months ahead, someone is going to be reviewing or basically seeing the work that I've done, well, if something is malicious, chances are a second set of eyes will have someone be reviewing that work as I completed it, right? So in that short period of time, we will be able to determine if there's anything that malicious is going on, if someone is doing something that they shouldn't have, and again, kind of managing or preventing that insider threat and the associated malicious activity associated with insider threats. So job rotation is another component as we talk about controls. Then we also have, and I'm sort of running out of room here, but that's okay. I may just clear out some of this over here just to make a bit of real estate. As we continue on, there's a few more that I'm sort of thinking of. So we've got our separation of duties. So I'm just going to put separation of duty here back up. So we've spoken about accounts, backups, clean that up, backups. And then we've also got things like employment. So how we handle both onboarding and offboarding. So onboarding procedures, offboarding procedures when we hire new staff and exit existing staff. So basically how the organization deals with that within the business. So there's a how-to procedure. We have to define that. So what happens when a person is hired? Well, maybe we would go through identity checks, background check. We may have to do maybe an AFP or a police background check. Maybe it's a working with children check. Maybe they have to have a baseline clearance. So we've got to go through a vetting process and define all that sort of stuff. So, you know, company policy will define and obviously read these so that, as a person gets onboarded, they'll have to read and comply with obviously our internal company policies. So that may be part of that, part of the onboarding procedure. Now, part of the offboarding procedure could be something similar to that as well, where we've got once we terminate the procedure of an existing staff member, well, we've got to hand back hardware, software, maybe licensing, um, and then you got the adequate of accounts and termination, disabling of those accounts, documentation there as well, subscriptions or access to systems, right? We have to document what those are. So we have to create these procedures, and when they are followed, then we can limit the damage because we've got things in obviously documentation form. We've got things that are signed, adhered to obviously by the team, and we've got a proper process in place where we can manage and obviously determine if there's any malicious intent happening during those two phases, and then prevent and limit that risk of data loss essentially. So they're the other two. Now we've got things like user awareness training, right? That's another component. So anyone from, we've got the CEO, got, staff members. So typically anyone part that throughout that process, no matter on what level you are throughout the organization, should be doing and enforcing user awareness training. Again, people are typically that user, weakest link in part of that chain of the process. So we want to ensure that we're training, we're supporting, we've got that, the guidelines there to support us through our user awareness training, and especially supporting information security and obviously having people be responsible for their own actions. And we obviously can have a document that outlines that people are responsible for their own actions. They'll have that signed and documented, and you know that's all great. So you are responsible for your information security um, and your actions. And then audits could be the last one as well. So if I just write audits here, audits, obviously, we wanted people to check our work and make sure the controls that we have are working. They're obviously meeting the goals of the objectives of the business. An auditor will come in, both you can have an internal or an external auditor, and they'll come in and check the security controls and the policies and make sure our controls are working. And the main thing here is they want to test those controls. We want to make sure that they're adequate. They're obviously reflecting if we've got our clean desk policy and those audits, and they come in and validate, yes, we do have a clean desk policy. No one has sensitive documents in front of their desk, and we are practicing our good security hygiene and stuff like that. So these help us identify weak points basically through that policy, through the control implementations, and help us measure what's working and what's not. So audits are a really big important part across our security control. So just keep that in mind. So there are a couple of the different security policies, different types of controls that we can implement to help us obviously manage risk adequately and obviously manage our risk hygiene across our appetite across the business and make sure that nothing bad happens. Should anything occur, we can help triage and manage those risks adequately. I hope you've enjoyed this video. See you all in the next video, and thank you all for viewing. Bye for now.